Hello, everyone. We are just getting started. Our custom at MIT is to begin classes 5 minutes after the hour, so we'll start at 2:05, and I'll introduce our guest speakers at that point. So just hold tight, if you would, for a few minutes while we're waiting for people to join us. If you're just joining us, we are going to start at 2:05 in just a couple of minutes. So hold tight, and thank you for joining us for this last session. All right, why don't we get started? It's 2:05 on the dot. So welcome everyone to this closing session of MIT's History of Now, Plagues and Pandemics course. We've saved our earliest chapter for the very end, Pandemics in the Premodern Era. And I'm delighted to introduce two wonderful scholars who have worked in this field, Michael McCormick and Nükhet Varlik. Professor McCormick teaches Roman and medieval history at Harvard. He is chair of the university's initiative on the science of the human past. Among many other publications, he's the author of a pair of articles on mass death during the fall of the Roman Empire that appeared in the Journal of Roman Archaeology in 2015 and 2016. Professor Varlik is an historian of the Ottoman Empire at the University of South Carolina. She's the author of the book Plague and Empire in the Early Modern Mediterranean World, The Ottoman Experience, 1347 to 1600, which appeared in 2015. She's also edited a volume entitled Plague and Contagion in the Islamic Mediterranean, which came out in 2017. And together, these two great scholars are here to help us understand the plagues known as the first and the second pandemics. The first associated with the fall of the Roman Empire, and the second that we often call the Black Death and its subsequent waves. So I want to invite each of our two guests to begin with some general comments on how their work can help us to understand the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. We'll start with our Romanist, and then proceed to the Ottoman experience. And if you would like to ask a question, please pose it in the Q&A function rather than the chat. So, Mike, the floor is over to you, please.
Thank you, Malik. It's great to be here. Thank you all for being here. It's a privilege to speak to you about the pandemics in antiquity. And to share with you some ongoing discoveries in ancient pandemics. Written history of pre-modern Western Eurasia records 4 major pandemics, 3 in the Roman Empire and 1 in medieval modern Eurasia. The pandemic began with the Black Death and continued into the 18th century. Nükhet is going to be talking to us about that. The Roman Empire experienced 3, the Antonine in the 2nd century, very poorly documented in the written sources, pathogen unknown, but increasingly scholars think that it was a quite important event. The plague of Cyprian, virtually unknown until a few new written sources were uncovered by Kyle Harper a couple of years back. The pathogen's unknown, it resembled Ebola, it was in the 3rd century. And finally, the Justinianic pandemic, which lasted for about 200 years, starting in 541, and that was bubonic plague. So the ancient and medieval plagues are documented in the written records, which are rich but very uneven. There's huge gaps in the written records, and of course, when there's gaps, that allows there's no more different interpretation is what was the pathogen behind the Justinianic pandemic. Exactly like the Black Death, it has been demonstrated robustly from ancient molecular evidence, from ancient DNA of the pathogen itself, from victims who died in Bavaria around 550, where we didn't even know the Justinianic pandemic had reached, that this was Yersinia pestis, bubonic plague, a rodent disease that spreads under certain circumstances to humans. Among written sources in 542, we have an eyewitness who was very close to the imperial court, who reports that Justinian commanded the Roman officials to count the bodies being carried out of the gates of the imperial capital in Constantinople, and that they gave up counting in despair at 230,000. According to the spotty written records, plague returned between 18 and 35 times between 541 and 750. What were its effects? The opinions differ. Older scholarship down to the late 1980s considered the plague to have had the epidemics of plague to have had minimal impact. How can we determine what the impact was of each outbreak over this 200-year period? That's one of the tasks that's been taken up by the new Max Planck Harvard Research Center for Archaeoscience that connects the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Germany with the Initiative for the Science of the Human Past at Harvard. And our teams are attacking this question of the Justinianic pandemic from a triple perspective: history, philology, and digital humanities approach to the ancient written evidence, archaeology, and archaeogenetics. The history and philology and digital humanities is traditional but very exciting and fundamentally important. The first elements can be seen in our geodatabase of written reports of epidemics, which you can access and download for your own work on the Digital Atlas of Roman Medieval Civilizations. The archaeological features we now know in the last couple of years consist of 3 types of features. One, the most obvious, mass graves, more than 5 people buried simultaneously with no sign of trauma, of violence. I set out, as Malik has kindly mentioned, to prepare the first archaeological inventory of this evidence, because people said there are no mass graves, therefore the pandemic was not significant. I found 80 some in 50 different places between the 4th century and the 8th century. And that's quite important, because not only does it demonstrate, even though we don't know what killed the people in these graves without doing a molecular analysis, it tells us where to look. And in fact, this inventory has led to a second set of identifications of the presence of Yersinia pestis from the ancient pathogen preserved in the teeth of the victims who died of it. The second type of archaeological feature are multiple burials. You only have a mass grave where you have masses of people. So if you have a village of 40 or 50 people, you're not going to have burials of 100 people. And so multiple burials turn out to be very important, 2 to 4 individuals. Plague DNA has also been found in individual burials, which is entirely in keeping with the written record, as we can discuss. The third and new is emergency burials. Archaeologists have begun to identify a series of cases in which skeletons were summarily deposited in existing holes in the ground. For example, robber trenches in which people had gone to dig out nice Roman stones to build barns with. They didn't bother to fill in the trenches, and people came along subsequently and deposited burials in them. In this case, this individual proved positive for Yersinia pestis in the 6th century on the southern French coast. So once we have the graves and the skeletons, we can turn to archaeogenetics. And that is the most powerful and revealing new tool that is going to take us to completely new places where the rich but uneven written record cannot take us. I had the privilege of participating in the team that performed the second robust extraction identification of the DNA of Yersinia pestis from a second 6th century cemetery in Bavaria, where again, no written texts mention the presence of the disease. Here, the genome of the bacterium was so well preserved that we were able to do whole genome sequencing, which when you're able to do it will allow you to compare the genomes of different bacteria that kill different people and see reconstruct the phylogeny, that is to say the genealogy of how the microbe mutated as it spread from victim to victim, accumulating mutations, some of which stayed. And so you can reconstruct a genealogy of the mutating microbe and track over time and space the spread of the disease. The most recent publication of our group has identified 8 new sites, many of them separated by several thousand kilometers, in Germany, France, Spain, and Britain, from various types of social features, villages to cities. We were able to reconstruct the phylogeny of most of these, of the bacterium that killed most of these victims. You see below the genetic genealogy going back now into prehistory and continuing down into the Black Death, as you can see. The phylogenetic distance from the root is really exciting. We suspect as we recover more genomes, we're going to be able to identify with increasing authority the date, the outbreak of the pandemic, of the epidemic outbreak of the pandemic out of the 15 to 30 some that occurred over 200 years. With the state of the genome of individual victims. And so we see, as you can see from this graph of relatedness, that we could hypothetically already propose associations between particular versions of the genome in particular victims in particular places. And reconstruct step by step, wave by wave, region by region, and even I think ship by ship, the spread of this horrible contagion. And the most stunning thing of all was the British data. I believed firmly, I thought there was, no, I should say, there was no rigorous evidence that's supported the conviction that the Justinianic plague's first outbreak reached Britain. The ancient DNA has proven me completely wrong. And in fact, it looks like the ancient DNA from an Anglo-Saxon cemetery from the middle of the 6th century in Britain is the most basal, the most original, the closest to the origin, to the original outbreak of the disease, which suggests that perhaps the disease spread at the very, to Britain in a ship at the very beginning. So the takeaways, this is a work in progress, but we've entered a new era thanks to molecular historical knowledge. If we combine history, archaeology, and genetics, we will be able to map each outbreak over time and space, and that will allow the potentially differing impact of different outbreaks at different times and spaces, and it will certainly illuminate the specific historical conditions and impact of this pandemic on communications network, on the economy, and on the challenges that people faced. Fear and anxiety, which I began to understand myself in March of this year, the impact on belief structures and institutions, scapegoating, and denial, because just as today people deny the reality of the plague, so, excuse me, of the COVID-19, so in antiquity people were inclined to do that and indeed continue to do so now. And finally, the adaptation. So there's a lot to do, the work's in progress, and I'm happy to talk about it. Thank you very much.
Mike, thanks very much. That's amazing how much granularity we are getting on the ancient plagues. let's turn it over to Nükhet for some opening comments from her perspective as an historian of the second pandemic in the Ottoman Empire. Nükhet. Nükhet, you're on mute right now, I think.
Sorry about that. Yes, I was on mute. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, all right. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. What I would like to do today, in keeping with the theme of the course, History of Now, is to offer a few insights about how the COVID-19 framework can help us think about past pandemics, and also if we can identify some ways that we can use historical insights to correct our pandemic thinking today. And in particular, I would like to point out two aspects of past pandemics that I think are important for our thinking today. And one of this is continuity, and the other is the globality of pandemics. So in a recent piece, I look at the long-term history of infectious diseases in human societies, and trying to use the model of persistent occurrences of past pandemics as a way of understanding our current day pandemic. And I, because I specialize on plague, but because plague offers the ultimate model for thinking along the lines of these long-term structures, I will use plague here as a case study, as a model to do this. And we're talking about a disease, a bacterial infection, and at the time of its first occurrence and its reoccurrences, an emerging infectious disease similar to what COVID-19 is. So thinking about this emerging infectious disease in historical terms, we're talking about a disease that has affected human societies at least for the last 5,000 years. But of course, for my own particular research, I'm drawing from the Ottoman experience. And as we just heard from Professor McCormick about what is called the first pandemic and how it affected the larger Mediterranean world and Europe, we are now shifting our attention to what historians call the second plague pandemic. That is to say, the pandemics, the outbreaks of plague that started with the Black Death in the mid-14th century and that continued afterwards. So my particular research is on the Ottoman Empire, looking at the late medieval and early modern epidemics of plague, largely, broadly speaking, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, the Black Sea world, and the Middle East and parts of North Africa. So within this extended geography, I look at the history of the recurrences of the Black Death during a 600-year time period. So the first recorded incidents of the plague in Ottoman sources date back to 1347, and the last occurrence of plague in, well, not Ottoman, but modern Turkish sources, again, within the same geographic area, dates to 1947. So we are talking about exactly 600 years of presence of a disease. And so I'm trying to use this as a model to think about how we think about past pandemics, and again, how we can use this thinking to understand our current day thinking about pandemics. So I would like to make two suggestions here. First of all, I believe it is important to think about pandemics not as short-term cataclysmic events, but as processes. And plague, again, is a perfect example to do this, perfect model to think about as a long-term process. And the other is that pandemics are global phenomena, at least trans-regional, if not entirely truly global like we are in today. And so for that reason, I think we need to abandon the local emphasis and shift our thinking to trans-regional thinking. And both of these ways of thinking, both thinking at as plagues or outbreaks or pandemics as short-term cataclysmic phenomena and thinking of them as local phenomena, have their own history that is something deeply embedded, deeply ingrained in the way we've been talking about past pandemics since at least the 18th century. So it has its own history that I'm not going to go into now, but I'm happy to talk about it during the discussion. But just looking at one example of the Black Death, I think will illustrate those points perfectly, in the sense that how do we think about the Black Death? Well, we think of Black Death as a European phenomenon. We still today, and many repercussions of those thinking and of that historical imagination again came up during the COVID-19, during the public discussions of the of past pandemics, of thinking about the Black Death as a European phenomenon. Of course, this is not a way of thinking about the Black Death that we can still maintain today. We cannot afford to think of disease in this geography alone, because we know for a fact that the Black Death occurred in a time period in the middle of 14th century in a world that was tightly connected. And of course, I should say the old world here, we're talking about Afro-Eurasia. There is at least no known evidence so far of its spread beyond it, but we know that in the middle of 14th century, the Afro-Eurasian disease zone was a tightly connected area. And if we want to isolate Europe in this broad connected world, we will be basically missing, we will be only looking at the tip of the iceberg, and we'll be missing out on a lot of other different components and interactions between different regions. And the other thing is looking at the long-term history of pandemics. And as Professor McCormick pointed out, we have now at the disposal of historians, we have now new techniques that became available, especially bioarchaeology and archaeogenetics, as tools that we can integrate into historical studies and rethink or question our written sources. So our written sources have led to certain pandemic narratives about plague, especially about the second pandemic, that wanted us to look at Europe in particular and the 14th century especially. But if we want to integrate non-written evidence, non-textual evidence, then we can expand these ways of thinking about the Black Death and the second pandemic in a broader framework. And this is, in fact, this is an exercise into thinking about how we can integrate molecular archaeology and historical sources to rethink the origins of the Black Death. And again, it's something that has been controversial for a very long time. And so drawing from the forthcoming work of Monica Green in this article, she's basically pushing us into rethink the origins of the Black Death into the 13th century instead of the 14th. But here the point I'm trying to make is that if we shift our thinking from the narrow focus to a broader one, I think there is a lot to be gained in understanding the dynamics of the disease and its interaction with different ecological zones, and how responses to it developed in different historical contexts. And again, my own research is on the Ottoman Empire, looking at least in my first book, in the first few centuries following the Black Death and recurrences of plague. And one of the most important findings that I had as a result of the research for my first book is that the circulation patterns of the second pandemic, the Black Death, and the outbreaks of plague that followed it were not really along the lines that this historical scholarship had been maintaining for a long time, in the sense that the historical scholarship had this very established conventional idea that the Black Death, but also the outbreaks of plague after that, continue in an east to west direction of spread. In my work, I complicate the trajectories of circulation of plague outbreaks in the larger Eastern Mediterranean world, and connecting it to the rise and expansion of the Ottoman Empire. So basically trying to connect the circulation of the disease with the expansion of the empire, and with the integration of different ecological zones under the control, under the configurations of an early modern state, and with trade, with conquest, with human and non-human mobility, and all sorts of interactions between the different parts of the Eastern Mediterranean world, we have the emergence of new plague networks. And again, in my book, I argue that these plague networks and these frequent recurrences of the disease transformed Ottoman society and led to a number of institutional interventions, especially in the domain of public health, that resulted in the adoption of new administrative policies for opening up new graveyards, new burial space, trying to develop a policy to keep cities into cleaner spaces, to clean the cities, and to establish a health administration and other administrative interventions to maintain. But I think the takeaway from this is, again, for today, is to think about a society that lived with this recurrent problem for centuries, and thinking about what this means in the long term. And again, just abandoning that kind of like narrowed time-specific point of view to something that is more widespread, and also thinking about these interactions. And interestingly enough, new research actually suggested, and this is very recent, there is a genetic condition that is widespread in Eastern Mediterranean populations today called familial Mediterranean fever. And that is caused by a genetic mutation. And now we understand that genetic mutation was caused by Yersinia pestis, and it provided a form of resistance to Yersinia pestis. And still today, 1 in 6 people in Turkey have this genetic mutation. And not only in Turkey, in populations, in Armenian population, Jewish population, Arab population, and Turkish population of the Eastern Mediterranean world, still have this legacy, the genetic imprint of this long-term phenomena. So we have new ways of thinking about this, thanks to genetics and other sciences and research methodologies, to rethink these long-term history of and the legacy of plague.
Thank you very much, Nükhet. That was Nükhet, did you finish your opening remarks?
Yes, I did.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. So let's do maybe a couple of follow-up questions. And I see some very interesting questions already coming in through the Q&A. But Mike, if I could circle back to you on the,
Alex, may I ask before you do? I'm getting signals that my internet connection is a little unreliable. So if you have a phone number that you could send in the chat that I can call if I go out.
To call into the webinar, or to call
or to you, and you can yeah, whatever.
Yeah, okay, I'll send you.
Webinar would be great.
I'll send you my.
Sorry.
I'll send you my. That's all right. I can send you my number right here. Okay, I'm actually hearing you pretty well. I mean, you're breaking up just for a couple of seconds, but I'm getting most of what you're saying actually. So. You could also turn off your video, but I think let's hold off on that. So here, Mike, the question is about city and country, actually, and what these burial graves actually suggest to us about how people experience the pandemic of the 6th century. So as I understand it, there's evidence of mass burials in cities, but that in the countryside, the burial practices your research is showing did not radically change. Is the lesson that we should take from this, Mike, that the pandemic is experienced as a catastrophe in the cities of the empire, but that in the countryside it was experienced in a very different way? I mean, what can we infer about how people experience the pandemic the differing styles of burial.
This is interesting, Malik, and it's a point well taken. So the written sources are quite explicit from the first outbreak in 541, 542, that at the beginning, people buried people normally. The deaths started very gradually, the increase in deaths, and normal burial rituals with funerals and so forth, and individual graves and family tombs were pursued in the cities, and this, which is where the documentation comes from. Most of our ancient records are about cities, not about the countryside. And as the epidemic increased, as the mortality increased, people became more and more desperate to find places to put the bodies, began abandoning the traditional ritual, which is really fundamental in a Mediterranean society, to not have the funerals, to not use the family tomb, where the whole family went every year on the anniversary of the death of different family members to commemorate and to think and be with them, and poured wine down a little funnel into their tomb in many cases so they could also enjoy it. All that began to be abandoned progressively. And as it really hit its peak, people just gave up. They couldn't do it anymore and dumped bodies out in the street. And the Emperor Justinian organized security forces to go out and collect them, and they were paid a high price to do so. In the countryside, you have much smaller populations, but the initial molecular evidence indicates a similar pattern there. In the case of the young man and young woman in their early 20s who were buried together, in which our team was able to identify the second robust ancient DNA of Yersinia pestis from a 6th century Bavarian village of Alten-Ading, they were buried in a completely normal way, with all their grave goods, and except that there were 2 of them together, which was odd.
Right.
There were 1 or 2 small aspects that a very sharp Bavarian archaeologist suspected there's something a little fishy with this, but nevertheless, it looks in general like a normal burial. As we go on, there are more burials with nothing in them in that cemetery that have not been tested. I've been working very closely with a wonderful French archaeologist, Claude Reynaud, on the sites on the coast of France. And there's a big debate, and has been for some decades, about an apparent shift in burial customs in late antique society along the French coast in the 6th and 7th century that has been connected up until now with social change. And we're beginning to wonder if there are deeper changes taking place that may be connected with this. Again, a work in progress, but I have to say that so far the molecular and archaeological evidence confirms the written reports. In the one city that we have, which is Valencia, or this, and Bourges, that's a small town, but in Valencia we have mass graves positive for Yersinia pestis.
Thank you very much, Mike. Nükhet, a follow-up question for you actually has to do with the title of one of the chapters of your book, which I believe is "Plague Comes from the West." So the sort of the mythology of pandemic in Europe, as I think you point out in your article, is that the pandemic always comes from the east, from China or from the Ottoman lands. I mean, the 1720 plague in Marseille, for example, is attributed to sources in the Eastern Mediterranean. What can we say about, what's fascinating about your work is that you kind of reshape the political geography of the Black Death. So what can we say about how communities in the Ottoman Empire experienced the sort of the geography of the plague in terms of its origins and its subsequent spread?
All right, thank you. So looking at the Ottoman sources and trying to locate information about the origins of outbreaks and about where they come from, how they affect society. And again, it's written sources offer plenty of evidence to gather that information. But in each case, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, the evidence basically tells us that plague comes from the next town, or the next region. So always is kind of thinking about it within a regional scale, right? At least from the testimony of our chroniclers, or perhaps following the roots of information that they were learning about plague. So we're technically tracing the roots of information, not the roots of the spread of plague in most cases. But I would like to put this in the perspective in terms of the ways both the contemporaries of the Black Death and the outbreaks that followed it, and also our own understanding of how we think about historical perspectives on the origins and the spread of plague. So throughout the late medieval and early modern period, both in the Ottoman Empire, in many and also in many European sources, looking at plague treatises, medical writing, historical chronicles, we see that pandemics were, or epidemics or plague outbreaks were understood as something that belonged to a place at a time. So it's always now and here. Right, some of this comes from the work of my colleague Laurie Jones, who worked on late medieval and early modern English and French plague treatises, and also partly from my own work, working with Ottoman historical sources. So they always think of plague in a place and in time, but no grand narratives. And the grand narratives, especially if you want to trace their origin, they come much later. And specifically, I was able to locate of how those narratives about how plague comes from the Ottoman Empire starts to develop. And especially 18th and 19th centuries are critical for this. And in fact, I argued in a recent article that the plague of Marseille is actually the turning point for anchoring those narratives and locating the East, an unidentified Oriental landscape, as the origin of all plagues that came to Europe. Later on in the 19th century, historical epidemiologists elaborated on this understanding and kind of produced our understanding of pandemics as something that comes from the other, the Oriental and all that. So there's a long history, there's a long genealogy into that way of thinking, but definitely it's not late medieval or early modern. That's not how people thought at the time. It's something that comes much later.
It's very interesting. Thank you, Nükhet. Mike, I don't know if can you add a footnote maybe to that discussion in the sense of the kind of the political topography of pandemic in the Roman Empire? Is there any awareness that it comes from this part of the empire or that part in terms of what available written evidence there is? And does your own research have anything to say about that?
Great, thank you. We have evidence for the initial awareness of an outbreak from the Justinian pandemic, from the first epidemic beginning in 541. It begins in the port town of Pelusium in the Egyptian Delta, which is the second port of Egypt, not the first, which is quite striking. And scholars have hypothesized that it may be connected with trade with the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, because Pelusium might be construed to be a little bit closer to that. And then otherwise, it's only with the last outbreak in 750 that we have some indications of where it might have started from, but even that's fairly fuzzy. And in between, there's very little. It's very much exactly as Nükhet has identified. Oh, it comes from the next place. If they even say where it comes from, the plague is coming and people are terrified. So it's really here the biomolecular evidence is going to be really cool, because it's going to, for the first time, allow us to track probably over time, province by province, area by area, even village by village, the spread of the disease. Yeah. And what we're going to be able to recover then are the communications networks, which are showing that my understanding of the strength of the communication networks between the Eastern Mediterranean and Western England, Eastern England, Eastern Britain, not Western Britain, which was well connected to the Mediterranean, in the 6th century are insufficient. The Yersinia pestis seems to show much stronger connections with the Eastern Mediterranean and Eastern, now colonized by the Anglo-Saxons than we had anticipated from other evidence. So the historians of the time have local or regional or imperial perspectives. We didn't know it was in Bavaria. There's one written source in 200 years that says plague, mentions Bavarian connection with plague, and it says plague went up to the boundaries of Bavaria. And implying it stopped there. So for that outbreak. So it's really going to break down just as the virus doesn't care whether you're in a red state or a blue state. Yeah. The Yersinia pestis did not care what empire or what political entity you were in, and it found the communication structures.
Very interesting. Thank you, Mike. We have a question about some of the methods and techniques that Mike you use, but Nükhet, it seems like I gather from your new project you're also very interested in using the evidence of genetics and of bioarchaeology. And one of our audience members asks, how should historians make use of these techniques if they don't always lead to the same conclusions? Or I guess the question is, do they lead to the same conclusions always? How do you verify the authority of these techniques of inquiry, and how do they interact with one another?
Right, should I go or?
Why not? Should either one, doesn't matter. Yeah, why don't you start, Nükhet? Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I think it's absolutely crucial for us historians working on past diseases to integrate non-textual sources. And because, I mean, at least, thinking about my own sources, there is so much we don't know. And, lack of sources, especially written sources for the 14th century. I mean, things get a little better after the 15th and 16th century in terms of the number of sources and what they cover and the kinds of information, the detailed information that you can get. But the first couple of centuries after the Black Death, really, written sources are very, very limited. And that's also a problem, I know, that for the first pandemic historians, working only with textual evidence would give us a very limited perspective. So in one way, this is to complement written sources, bringing textual, non-textual evidence. But at the same time, we also need to keep in mind as historians, and again, most of us have been trained to work with texts. But at the same time, we need to remember, at least when we're talking about a biological phenomenon, text will give us a very limited perspective. Almost all of my written sources give the perspective of the human actors, of course, but also urban and elite actors, and mostly male actors, right, in a society. So if I want to talk about a past disease that is especially a zoonotic disease that also involves the agency of animals, the rodents, and climate, and the larger ecological changes, how can I rely only on the testimony of humans, and at that, a very limited number of a section of that society? So this is one way of complicating the sources, and by bringing bioarchaeological evidence, by bringing archaeogenetics, and so trying to understand and bringing different perspectives and to complicate the perspectives that we get from written sources. So yes, I am very keen on bringing non-textual evidence and trying to find a way of putting them into dialogue.
Yeah, very interesting. Mike, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yes, absolutely. It's really important, particularly because it may not be widely understood by our students that there has been a revolution in ancient DNA technology and methods in the last really 5 or 6 years. And because of that, we are able to extract authentic ancient DNA from remains that were not productive in the past, and that the protocols for authentication of what is being found are much more rigorous and reliable today. So in sum, the technology was so powerful that it just multiplied zillions of copies of every DNA lying around, including in the laboratory. And so the problem of contamination clouded many of the early efforts, including my own, to do laboratory identification of the pathogen in ancient victims. Those problems have largely been overcome. Then there can be, one needs to verify the work. It's very, very difficult work. It's important to understand that. You have to wear the suits that people wear in COVID wards and be in special labs, and the suits are very hot and they're very cumbersome, and you have to wear them through the entire thing, and it's long and difficult procedures. It's hell to do. It's a very hard work, and bravo to the young graduate students and postdocs who are doing this, leading us all in it. But it is good. The results are robust. Most of the publications, all the publications, are in scientific journals. They go through the rigors, sometimes reliable, sometimes not, of peer review, of the peer review process. And the genetic material is published online and in supplementary online materials, so that other geneticists can go and verify your analysis and run the genetic data that you have through their software and see whether they agree with the probabilistic statistical methods you've used to come to these conclusions. So all of this is ongoing dialogue, and occasionally there are improvements. You know, one article gets a little bit better preserved ancient DNA of another victim from another place from the same outbreak, and they see, oh, it's the same, and you can identify a couple small mistakes in the work of the previous researchers. So cumulatively, the understanding improves even on the very basic level of the sequence of the base pairs of the ancient DNA.
Yeah, very interesting. I have a follow-up on that, but let me save it for the end if we have time, because we've got another interesting question here in the Q&A about the wave-like character, if I could put it that way, Nükhet, of pandemics, and speculating about whether or not after COVID-19 we'll have another wave, COVID-25, COVID-30. Maybe if I could just combine that with another version of that question for you, Nükhet, and perhaps Mike also, since we've got a series of ancient Roman pandemics here. I mean, we're sort of getting at, in our current moment, we're getting to the stage where we're thinking about life. I mean, we have a very serious second wave right now, but we're also, because of the vaccine, you know, we're starting to talk about, well, we're getting ready to go back to life as normal, pre-pandemic life, so to speak. And could you speak to this sort of this sentiment in the air of anticipation of a post-pandemic life, which is also a pre-pandemic life? And how does that look to you from your perspective of an historian of pandemics who thinks about process, or as the questioner puts it, waves of COVID-19?
Right, complicated question, but I'll try what I can. So first of all, epidemiologists and historical epidemiologists have developed different ways of thinking about the spread of pandemics, right? Wave model seems to be a very commonly used one, but I've even heard some epidemiologists today thinking about that the wave model is not even like the best or the most intuitive one. Some are actually thinking of this as forest fires, right? Which may be another way of thinking about it. But there is a very important distinction that we need to think about right now, because when we're talking about COVID, we're talking about an airborne pathogen that is directly transmitted from person to person. And so let's just try to be a little mindful about, you know, how we talk about past pandemics, especially we're talking about plague. It's not the exact mechanism of spread. So it's not a contagion of directly person to person, though we know that in certain cases, plague could also be transmitted as an airborne pathogen from person to person. But the main driver of plague, especially in the second pandemic, we need to understand what's going on with the rodents as the host of the disease and the fleas that are vectors of the disease. So under normal circumstances, you don't expect bubonic plague to be transmitted from person to person directly. That, you know, that transmission pattern is also something that has broader implication to thinking about the larger spread of pandemics. So for that reason, I think I was, you know, as guilty as other historians of drawing those arrows of circulation of plague from here to here. But at the same time, I think there is another component to it that we need to keep in mind, is that it's not only circulation of disease from a place to place, but we also need to think about its long-term persistence in soil, in the rodent host, and in the entire ecological framework that kind of maintains a sustained disease long term. So it's not only waves or, you know, forest fires or how we want to think about, but I think it's more complicated than it. And I think plague, again, is a perfect model disease to think about that.
Yeah, I would concur entirely with Nükhet on that. And those who've thought about this question more than I have are very skeptical of the metaphor of wave for the first or second pandemic for that matter. Kyle Harper maintains that we should refer to them as amplification events. And there's a study neutrality in that may be a little bit more accurate. I'm sure you've seen, as I have, that in the discussion of COVID, are we in the second wave? Is this the second wave? Is this the third wave? That's really a matter of metaphors. We don't really understand the details of the genetic spread, rise and fall, although we can see in the case of this airborne pathogen, the influence of human events that bring together people in conditions to spread them. I suspect Halloween, certainly Thanksgiving, we're seeing now the effect of that. But as Nükhet underscores, COVID is a disease of humans transferred by aerosols between us as individuals, whereas plague is a disease of rodents, and it only gets to humans when there are no more rodents left in the community, and the fleas which live off them, which don't necessarily like humans, have to go get some human blood to keep going. So the plague is way more complicated because, as Nükhet emphasizes, it really is a disease of animals. That's where it lives, and it comes to us only occasionally. And the written sources are not much interested in animals of any kind, unless they're making money off of them. So it's a very complicated procedure, but we need to be very careful about these metaphors, as helpful as they may be at a very elementary level.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So a question here about ethics, actually. Can both presenters speak to historians' roles in countering reductionist arguments around genetic/cultural responsibility for epidemic spread? In other words, does the uptake of molecular archaeology and paleogenomics complicate historians' ethical roles? Who would like to speak to that one?
Well, I can say a couple words about it. We actually wrote an essay. Our leadership team at the Max Planck Harvard Institute wrote a research center wrote an essay about that. And I think it was published in Science Advances a year or two ago about human genetics, because there has been some pretty untoward and pretty unscientific exploitation of initial genetic identifications of ancient populations in terms of modern politics in very different parts of Eurasia, and today of modern Eurasia. So it is indeed something that requires serious scrutiny and serious reflection, both with respect to human genetics and then, of course, the question of scapegoating that you raised, Malik, which we have seen in the past, and which we see very much in the present with the idea that a virus has some kind of national identity and that its transmission is an issue of national intent rather than the communication structures and infrastructures and political and public health incompetence. So there are profound ethical issues, and as I said, we've started to try to address them for human genetics, and we will continue to do so because we're getting powerful, amazing new evidence telling us stuff we never imagined we would know, and showing us stuff that we didn't believe was out there that looked completely contrary to the historical record. Sometimes it confirms the historical record, sometimes it completely contradicts it, and we have to go forward step by step, rigorously, carefully, and with great integrity and circumspection.
Right. I mean, I agree with everything Mike said, but just to quickly add to it, I think I see the role of the historian, and there is an ethical responsibility in terms of, research, but at the same time, I see the historian's role as more like offering guidance to paleogenetics research. Just more specifically in my own research, almost all of the genomes of the second pandemic, Yersinia pestis, come from Europe. There are just one or two outside of Europe, but that's mostly from European evidence. What are we going to find out if we expand that perspective? And again, I see the historian's role in identifying the regions that are important in this and complicating those narratives. So there are many ethical responsibilities that the historian has in this.
I think we're going to have to make that the last word on the topic of Varlik, of Nükhet, of pre-modern pandemics. And I want to thank you both, Mike and Nükhet, for this wonderful session. I wish we had more time to talk about this. Thank you to everyone who's followed along this course with us to explore pandemics past and present. It's been great to have you. If you've missed some of our sessions, they're all up on our YouTube channel. And I wanted to send out a reminder to the students that we're going to have a wrap-up session of about 30 minutes right after this is done at 3 o'clock, 3:05, using the Zoom invite that was sent out. So thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Nükhet and Mike, for being our guests. That was really fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Malik, for organizing it. Thank you all.
Thank you for organizing it.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.